started with a photograph. You've probably seen it. A black column of crude oil rising from a wooden derrick into a white Texas sky 4 miles south of Beaumont in January 1901. It is one of the most reproduced images in American industrial history. The birth of the oil age, the spectacle. But if you look carefully at the base of the photograph, past the column, past the ruined derrick, you can make out the shapes of men. They are soaked in petroleum. They have been soaked for days. I spent a long time looking at those shapes before I realized that the standard history of Spindletop begins and ends with the column, the gusher, the boom, the companies, the fortunes. It does not spend much time on the men standing underneath it, or on the 9 days they spent breathing hydrogen sulfide gas inside a cloud that a single spark would have turned into a firestorm. For 9 days, between January 10 and January 19, 1901, the Lucas Gusher at Spindletop Hill produced somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 barrels of crude oil per day. More petroleum in a single day than every other well in the United States combined. The derrick was destroyed. The drill pipe had been ejected from the hole like a projectile. The machinery was ruined, and the oil did not stop. For every one of those 9 days, a single spark would have ignited it. A lit match, a horseshoe on a stone, a steel wrench dragged across a bolt head. The field would have burned, and the men in it would have burned with it. And the technology to fight an oil well fire of that magnitude would not exist for another 20 years. No blowout preventer, no fire code, no protocol, no precedent of any kind. I went looking for the rules those men followed during those 9 days. What I found was a story that the photograph cannot hold. If you had asked anyone in Beaumont, Texas in 1895 about Patillo Higgins, they would have told you he was out of his mind. Higgins was not a geologist, not an engineer, not a man with credentials or connections of any kind. He was a one-armed brickmaker who had taught himself to read rock formations by traveling to the Pennsylvania oil fields and studying how they worked. He had lost his left arm in a gun accident as a teenager. He had served time for assault. He had found religion, gotten baptized, and started teaching Sunday school at a Baptist church in Beaumont. And somewhere between the conversion and the classroom, he had become fixated on a low hill 4 miles south of town that the locals called Spindletop. Gas seeped from the ground there. Sulfur water bubbled in 5 sour mineral springs. Higgins would light matches over the vents for his Sunday school class, watching the gas puff and flare in the open air. He was convinced there was an ocean of oil beneath that hill, not a pocket, an ocean. He formed the Gladys City Oil, Gas, and Manufacturing Company in 1892 with 3 partners. He named it after a girl in his Sunday school class. His plan went beyond oil. He wanted to build a model industrial city on top of the reservoir. Factories, homes, a community powered by cheap fuel from beneath the ground. They drilled 3 wells, cable tool rigs, the old Pennsylvania method, pounding through the earth with a heavy bit on a cable. Everyone hit quicksand at 300 feet and collapsed. The sand swallowed the bits, the pipe, and the money. The Texas state geologist said publicly that there was no chance of finding petroleum at Spindletop. Partners left. Money dried up. People in Beaumont stopped taking Higgins's calls. He ran a newspaper advertisement looking for investors. He received 1 reply. It came from an Austrian mining engineer named Captain Anthony F. Lucas, who had been prospecting for sulfur in Louisiana and happened to be the leading American expert on salt dome formations. Lucas looked at Higgins's data, looked at the hill, agreed. But Lucas drilled another well, and it failed too. At 575 feet, he ran out of money. He pulled up just enough crude to fill a small glass vial, took that vial to Pittsburgh, and convinced 2 Pennsylvania oilmen, John Gailey and James Guffey, to finance 1 more attempt. The Mellon banking family came in behind them. I spent a long time looking at the contract that resulted. It left Lucas with an 1/8 share. Higgins, the man who started everything, who endured a decade of ridicule for believing in this hill, received nothing. His name does not appear in the agreement. The man who was right got cut out before the well that proved him right was even drilled. In the fall of 1900, Lucas contracted with the Hamill Brothers contracting company out of Corsicana, Texas. The terms were simple. Drill to 1,200 feet, $2 a foot. Total payment upon completion, $2,400. Al Hamill was 24 years old. His brother Kurt was 28. They brought a fireman named Will Bird, who everyone called Peck, and they arrived in Beaumont with a rotary drilling rig, a boiler, and a carload of pipe they unloaded and stacked by hand. They could not find a derrick builder in Beaumont. They could not find a carpenter willing to take the work, so they trampled down marsh grass taller than a man, swatting mosquitoes that came in clouds thick enough to choke on, and built the derrick themselves. The timber was green and wet, and would not fit the pattern they had brought from Corsicana. They laid it out on the ground and cut a new one, the way a woman cuts fabric for a dress. 10 days later, they had an 84-foot derrick, rough but solid, built by 3 men with no blueprint and no help. It held. They dug a slush pit, 16 feet by 30 feet by 3 feet, and lined it with red Beaumont clay. And they drilled a water well to feed the boiler. 20 feet down, the water came up bubbling with gas. They started drilling with a 12-inch bit in October. They hit water sand, then hard sand, then gumbo. There was no geologist to advise them. They had no formation logs, no seismic data, no way to know what was beneath them until the bit was already in it. They experimented through each layer, losing weeks at a time. At one point, the hole swallowed their bit entirely. They fished it out, sharpened it, and went back in. 6 weeks in, far behind schedule, running out of money and running out of patience. At 600 feet, gas blew water out of the hole hard enough to damage the drill. Sharp sand shot out as if from a furnace, chewing into the machinery and stripping the teeth off their bits. They shut down, waited for the gas to exhaust itself, repaired what they could, and went back in. They decided to keep the rotary and the pump running day and night to prevent another blowout. 18-hour shifts, they called them towers. 3 men rotating through an 18-hour grind, sleeping in a shack near the well, eating when they could for $80 a month. Kurt had brought his wife and family and settled them nearby. Al and Peck boarded with them. The walls of the well kept collapsing, sand caving in, bearing the pipe, swallowing their bits. So the Hamills mixed cattle manure, water, and red Beaumont clay into a slurry and pumped it down the hole to coat the walls, stabilizing the bore, holding the formation in place, keeping the sand from eating their equipment. I keep coming back to this detail. Every rotary drill operation on the planet uses drilling mud today. Billions of dollars worth of engineered fluid, keeping wells from collapsing from the Gulf of Mexico to the North Sea to the Permian Basin. The Hamills invented it in a cow pasture because they had no other option and no one to tell them it could not work. They called it mud. By Christmas, they were near collapse. Gailey told them to shut down, go home, rest. They set fresh pipe to 920 feet and left. January 1st, 1901. It was the first day of a new century. 3 men in a buckboard driving across the coastal plain toward a well that seemed unlikely to pay for itself. Al had contracted to drill to 1,200 feet. They were behind schedule, exhausted, running out of bits. By January 10th, they had hit rock at 1,020 feet. The bit would drop 5 or 6 inches one direction, back up if turned another way. They pulled pipe, sharpened bits, went back in. Every bit they owned was worn to nubbins. That morning, Al brought a new one from Beaumont. At about 700 feet down, a low rumble. Mud began bubbling. Then the drill pipe started rising on its own, pushed from below by something none of them had ever encountered. 6 tons of 4-inch pipe shot through the top of the derrick. It took the elevators, the traveling block, the crown block. Pipe broke in midair and fell in twisted coils around the rig. Rocks followed, then gas. A roar so loud it carried to Beaumont 4 miles north. Then silence. They crept back. Al picked up a shovel. A chunk of mud blew out of the 6-inch hole like a cannon shot. Blue gas. They ran. The third time they approached, they could hear it. Bubbling deep in the earth. Oil rising and falling with the gas pressure, each pulse higher than the last. Then over the derrick floor. Then through the top. A black column, 150 feet, 200 feet. crude oil and rock and sand screaming into the Texas sky. McFadden's carpenters, building a rice barn within hollering distance, abandoned their work and rode for town at a gallop. Al sent Peck to find Captain Lucas. Mrs. Lucas had already seen the column from her doorstep. Lucas came over the hill in his buckboard at a dead run. His horse stopped short at the gate and pitched him to the ground. He landed on his feet and came running. Al, what is it? What is it? Why, it's oil, Captain. Oil. Lucas grabbed him, grabbed Kurt, grabbed Peck. He said, "Thank God." Within an hour, people arrived from Beaumont, in buggies, on horseback, on foot. They came within 150 feet of the well. Every time the wind shifted, oil spray drove them back. By evening, crude had drifted into town on the Gulf breeze. Sulfur gas hung in the streets. It stained the white houses black and orange. Some residents held prayer meetings. They thought they were watching the end of the world. They were watching the beginning of one. Here is where the story the photograph does not tell begins. The gusher made the headlines. The boom made the fortunes. But for 9 days, between the blowout and the capping, a handful of men lived inside a fire that had not started yet. Lucas understood the danger before anyone. He had Kurt sworn in as a deputy sheriff on the spot. He hired guards, armed them with shotguns, and stationed them in lines east and west of the well. His orders were simple: keep the people back. Do not let anyone smoke. No smoking within the perimeter. No metal tools near the wellhead, no horses with iron shoes inside the oil-soaked zone, because a shod hoof striking stone throws sparks the same way a hammer strikes an anvil. No lanterns after dark, no open flame of any kind, no friction. There were men stationed around the well whose only job was to watch. Watch for a cigarette in the crowd, watch for a lantern carried too close in the dark, watch for the scrape of iron on rock. They watched in shifts, day and night, in a perimeter soaked with crude oil that grew wider with every hour the well kept flowing. For 9 days they watched. They were the spark spotters, not a title anyone gave them, not a job description that existed in any manual. A role invented on the spot because the alternative was burning alive. I found references to similar safety protocols in the later development of oil well firefighting. By mid-century, the industry standard for capping operations required brass tools, bronze tools, or paraffin wax-coated implements, specifically because steel on steel generates sparks that ignite gas. Red Adair and the Kinley family would build entire careers around controlling oil well fires with non-sparking equipment. But the blowout preventer was not invented until 1924. In 1901, none of that technology existed. These men were writing the first draft of rules that would take 2 more decades to formalize, and they were writing them soaked in crude, armed with shotguns and common sense. The first oil well fire in American history had killed 19 people in Rouseville, Pennsylvania in 1861. A gusher blew, a steam boiler ignited the crude, and the crowd that had gathered to watch was consumed. That well produced 3,000 barrels a day. This one was producing 100,000. Consider what that means. There was no tankage anywhere in the Beaumont area. Nobody had built storage for oil because nobody had expected oil at this scale. Nobody had expected oil at all. The crude pooled on the ground. Lucas threw up dirt levees to contain it. The railroad men built embankments to protect the southern Pacific tracks. Oil ran across fields that were supposed to grow rice, soaked into the soil, flowed down ditches, and collected in a natural draw near the rail line, forming a lake of crude 3/4 of a mile long. Every day the lake grew. Every day the fire risk expanded with it. And every day the crowds grew too. People arrived from across Texas, from Louisiana, from as far as California. Speculators, promoters, drillers, con men, reporters, all of them pressing closer to the fence, all of them potential sources of ignition. On the Sunday after the blowout, 500 or 600 spectators milled around in the pasture. Kurt and Peck worked near the well in slicker suits, keeping the crowd back. Then they saw a man ride in on horseback with a boy mounted behind him. The boy lit a pipe. He dropped the match into the oil-soaked grass. Flames, black smoke, a stampede toward Beaumont. Kurt ran toward the fire. peck behind him. They beat at the flames with their slicker coats until the coats burned through, then with their denim jumpers, then their shirts off their backs. The fire crept toward the well. "Bring me some boards," Kurt shouted. Men returned with boards from McFadden's barn, 50 of them. They threw them on the line of flame closest to the well and beat the fire down, section by section. More than an acre of grass burned before they contained it. Eyal arrived, alerted by the smoke. He looked at the blackened ground, looked at the Gusher still screaming. "If it had ever got to the well," he said, "I don't know what we'd have done with it." That line comes from the Hamill Brothers' oral history, recorded in the 1950s by Dr. William A. Owens using the Columbia University Oral History Project methodology. It was published in American Heritage magazine in June 1958. Al said it decades later, and the sentence still carries the weight of a man who understood exactly how close they came to dying in a cow pasture south of Beaumont. This is one machine, one well, one crew. There are hundreds of stories like it, buried in company ledgers, coroner's files, patent filings, that nobody has opened since they were submitted. Subscribe if you want to see what's in them. Telegrams arrived from across the country offering to cap the well. Estimates ranged up to $10,000. A man who claimed to be a hydraulic engineer appeared with written authorization from Gailey himself. He studied the Gusher, looked at Al Hamill, and said words that I keep returning to. "You can certainly have the job if you want it. I wouldn't shut it off if they gave me the well, lease, and everything belonging to it. It's too dangerous." A professional walked away from the biggest oil strike in history. The Hamill brothers did not walk away, not because they were reckless, because there was no one else. Gailey arrived and estimated the flow between 80,000 and 100,000 barrels per day. He looked at Jim Hamill, who had come from Corsicana to help. "Well, you boys drilled the well. What do you think about shutting it in?" "Well, Mr. Gailey, I think we can do it." "All right, go to it." That night, the Hamills and Captain Lucas drew plans for something that had never been built. Jim arranged for heavy timbers and clamps. Al took 2 steel rails from the Southern Pacific Railroad. Nobody asked permission. Before any of it could work, a collar welded to the 10-inch pipe during drilling had to be cut off and the threads redressed. Cutting it meant straddling the pipe with a hacksaw and diamond points, inches from the hole, while oil rained down and explosive gas filled the air around the blade. Explosive! Al volunteered. He was the only unmarried brother. He went to Beaumont and found a pair of farm goggles, the kind used for threshing grain. He taped them to his face and walked in. Goggles. J.S. Cullinan, who had later found the Texas company, stood watching with Jim. J.S. Cullinan warned Jim, "Now, Jim, you watch that kid. He is in great danger. If he hits a spark there, it would be impossible to get him out." Danger. Men stood within arm's reach, ready to drag Al clear. He straddled the pipe all afternoon. Oil poured down his back and arms. The gas made him dizzy. He could only work 2 or 3 minutes at a stretch before crawling out for air, then back, then out, then back. Dizzy. He cut the collar in 2, sprung it off, dressed the threads without error. Without error. What the Hamills built on that wellhead had never existed before. They pulled the derrick floorboards, buried 4x12 timbers, and bolted them to the derrick legs. Bolted the stolen railroad rails to the timbers, built a carriage that slid along the rails, carrying a valve assembly, fittings, and connections directly over the hole. Every bolt, every joint fastened to the derrick. If the pressure from below dislodged the carriage, the entire structure would go with it. First, this was the first Christmas tree. The oil industry still calls it that. It is an assembly of valves, spools, and fittings that controls wellhead pressure. Every deep oil and gas well on the planet uses one today. The design has been refined, machined to precision, and manufactured at scale, but the principle is the same one the Hamills worked out that night with pencil and paper, sitting in a shack near a well that would not stop screaming. Stolen rails, heavy timber, chain tongs, a valve assembly built under a rain of crude oil in a cow pasture in southeast Texas. There was no manual, there was no engineer on call. There was the problem, and there were their hands. The well was still throwing rocks, limestone ejected at velocity, rising high, falling back in a spray of oil. One rock striking the valve would crack it. They had one valve. There would be no second attempt. They waited, watched. The same patience the spark spotters had shown for 9 days, watching for rocks now instead of fire. On January 19th, in the morning, Jim came out to the well. Jim asked, "Well, boys, how has it been acting?" They answered, "No rocks this morning." He watched with them until after 11 o'clock. Then he said, "Well, let's shut her in." Shut. The brothers looked at one another. 9 days, beating fire with boards, sleeping in oil-soaked clothes, breathing gas that could drop them where they stood. It came down to this: one valve, one pipe, one try. "Kurt, I'll work the carriage. You turn the valve, will you?" Al pulled the carriage along the rails with chain tongs until the valve hung directly over the pipe. Kurt moved in, lowered it, screwed it onto the threads his brother had dressed under a rain of crude oil with a hacksaw and a pair of threshing goggles taped to his face. Valve. One moment, a roar that had been screaming for 9 consecutive days. The next, silence. Kurt collapsed, overcome by gas. They dragged him to open air and brought him around. They packed rope between the pipes, poured cement, covered the valve in dirt to insulate it from fire. The well was shut in. Days later, a spark from a passing locomotive ignited the oil lake along the railroad tracks. The fire they had spent 9 days preventing arrived anyway, from a direction nobody had guarded. A man on horseback set fire to the opposite side to create a backburn. 2 walls of flame rushed toward each other across the surface of the lake. When they met, the impact threw sheets of burning crude into the air, and the concussion shook buildings in Beaumont 4 miles away. Smoke rolled over the city. It blotted out the sun at mid-afternoon. Then rain came and washed soot over every surface. Houses already stained orange from 9 days of oil spray turned solid black. Again, prayer meetings. Again, people convinced this was the end. It was not. The mound of dirt covering the valve held. The cement held. The rope packing between the pipes held. Everything the Hamills built with their hands in 9 days of working under a rain of crude oil held against a fire that consumed the prairie around it. Beaumont's population went from 10,000 to 50,000 in 3 months. Hotels ran shifts, 20 men to a room. Boarding houses charged $1 a night for a cot on a porch. Men who could not find beds slept in the streets, in the rail yards, in empty boxcars along the Southern Pacific Line. Gambling halls operated around the clock. Land that could not sell for $150 a few years earlier changed hands for $20,000. One well that had cost $10,000 to drill sold for $1.25 million. Oil sold for 3 cents a barrel. Water sold for $6. People called it Spindletop, and the name fit. Fortunes were made in the morning and gambled away by midnight. Con men sold shares in companies that did not exist, drilling leases on land they did not own. The entire economy of southeast Texas was rewritten in 90 days. Within a year, 285 wells were producing on Spindletop. More than 500 companies incorporated: the Texas Company, Gulf Oil, Humble Oil, Magnolia Petroleum, Sun Oil, names that became Texaco, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Mobil. Everyone traces its founding to a salt dome under a cow pasture that a one-armed brickmaker insisted had oil beneath it. Standard Oil, which controlled 83% of American petroleum, could not enter the Gulf Coast fields. Texas antitrust law had already expelled a Standard affiliate for predatory practices. Rockefeller's monopoly broke against the state line. Before Spindletop, petroleum was lamp fuel. Coal ran everything. But at 3 cents a barrel, oil became cheap enough to burn. Railroads converted, ships converted. The first American automobile show had opened in New York City 2 months before the Gusher blew. The car had a future now. That future ran on what came out of this hole. Then it left. Overproduction drained the shallow reservoir. Every new well punched into the dome pulled pressure from the ones beside it. Too many straws in the same cup. 17.5 million barrels in 1902, the best year. By 1903, half that. By 1904, down to 10,000 barrels a day. Derricks came down. Speculators moved on. The hotels emptied. The gambling halls closed. The hill that rewrote the American economy was nearly a ghost town within 3 years of the strike that made it famous. A second boom would come in 1925, when deeper drilling found oil on the flanks of the Salt Dome at 5,400 feet. But by then, the Hamills were long gone, and so was Higgins. Patillo Higgins never became wealthy from Spindletop. He had been cut from the deal before the well was drilled, but he never stopped looking. At nearly 90 years old, he was still driving his Model A Ford out to the fields with a pick and a shovel. He died at 92. Among his papers, they found a document dated 1901, signed by 32 citizens of Beaumont and attested by the county clerk. It was an apology. It said Mr. Higgins deserved the whole honor of discovering and developing the Beaumont oil field. The honor, not the money, not the equity, not the naming rights. The Hamills went back to work. They'd been paid $2,400 for drilling the well that launched the modern petroleum industry, invented drilling mud, and built the first Christmas tree valve assembly. The companies that grew from that well would generate hundreds of billions of dollars across the next century. The contract said $2 a foot. They drilled 1,139 feet. They were paid in full. I started with a photograph. The black column, the white sky. What I found beneath it was something the image does not hold. 9 days of men standing in crude oil, watching for the smallest fire, building tools that had never existed, following rules they were writing as they went. A 24-year-old with a hacksaw and a pair of threshing goggles taped to his face, straddling a pipe, while a man he had never met told his brother that if the kid hit a spark, they would never get him out. Today, the wellhead sits in swampland on private land south of Beaumont. You cannot walk to it. A flagpole flies the Texas flag over the spot. The pink granite monument they erected in 1941 had to be relocated because the ground was subsiding. When you pull that much oil out from under a hill, the hill does not stay where you left it. America wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in the dark, inside furnaces, under 40-ton weights, and sometimes under a rain of crude oil, watching for sparks, with nothing between you and the fire but a set of rules no one had written yet. The records are still there, in basements, in state archives, in company files marked equipment losses, where the names should be, we just have to open them.